as we start off the Song of Solomon. It'd be wrong, or at least it seems like it'd be wrong for me not to say God is amazing. Understanding that we are going to title this one Her and maybe subtitle it Our House. Understanding that the first few chapters, or really I think the entire book, structures around three main characters. First of all, her, the beloved, then of course Solomon, the king, and then the others who are kind of a chorus in the background, adding commentary throughout. And they're all three going to appear in this first chapter. And I want to follow that structure in talking about three things that stood out to me from the first chapter, leading up to why we thought it might be best to title it Our House. Understanding that this first chapter starts out with her perspective, with an ad lib from the others, and then finishing up with what seems to be more like a conversation between her, the others, and Solomon. And the thing that really caught my attention, or might have caught my attention most, is the one that seems to be most debated online, and that's, is she black? Who knows? But it specifically says that she is not just dark, she is very dark, and that could simply be because she was, according to the structure we want to follow, an outcast. That seems to clearly be the case from the text. Why? Because she was not popular among her siblings. Specifically, her brothers cast her out to be keeper of the vineyard, and that's what she attributes her darkness to. Understanding that, we'll literally see that in roughly verses 5 through 6, where it says, I am very dark, but lovely, O daughters of Jerusalem, like the tents of Kedar, like the curtains of Solomon. Do not gaze at me because I am dark, because the sun has looked upon me. My mother's sons were angry with me. They made me keeper of the vineyards, but my own vineyard I have not kept. Leading to that second third. She was not simply an outcast left to do what seems to be work in the sun that darkened her complexion, but she was a servant. Understanding that a person who is working so much in the fields of others that they neglect their own bears the marks of servanthood. At least it seems to be that pattern over and over again in the word, even if that's a subtle theme. But the third thing I want to focus on, or that caught my attention, at least understanding I'm new to this passage and I haven't read it very much because some of the passages or parts of it seem kind of awkward, meaning it has more eros terms, meaning those four terms for love in Greek. One of them is eros, which talks about the erotic love. This is one of the most erotic passages I've seen in the Bible, and that's usually what catches attention. And so that's one of the reasons why I personally steered away from it, and must confess, I am probably as little acquainted with this book as any in the Bible. But God willing, my prayers have been answered, and I have at least something accurate. And among the things that we've already talked about is, let me get to the point, the third thing, and that is the progression that she seems to make from whatever outcast status that she had to being betrothed to the king and eventually his queen. As we may be able to see in the progression of the way that she talks about Solomon's things or the king's things, and eventually progresses into a way in which she talks about them becoming our things. Thus our title, Our House. First, looking at the way she talks about the king in verse 4, draw me after you. Let us run. The king has brought me into his chambers. A similar sentiment we'll see in verse 12, where she will say, while the king was on his couch, my nard gave forth its fragrance. But by the end of the chapter, in the last two verses, she begins to go from talking about his possessions to their collective possessions. In verses 16 and 17 reading, behold, you are beautiful, my beloved, truly delightful. Our couch is green. The beams of our house are cedar. Our rafters are pine. Like we said, thus the title. And so in this chapter that we have entitled She, Our House, we're getting to see a progression where she seems to go from outcast and servant to betrothed and queen. And it's not all that different from the progression we will see in the life of Solomon's own father, David, who was, even amongst his brothers, an outcast to become a shepherd, not even called in when they were told a king would be anointed from among Jesse's sons. David was the one they left out to tend the sheep, himself noted as being ruddy or red in appearance. Likewise, his progression went from being an outcast shepherd to a king. Not all that different from the progression that we saw in the life of Joseph, who, even though he had status with his father amongst his brothers, the status he had with his father actually drew their resentment and provoked them to sell him into slavery, which eventually led him into the prison. But it did not repress his talents and the blessings he had from God, who eventually exalted him to essentially rule over Egypt. And likewise, Christ, shedding his status as God's son to take on the form of a servant on earth, only to be exalted as king forever. Which may help us understand why out of all Solomon's women, he takes the time to write about his marriage to this one whose ascent may bear a striking resemblance not only to his father David's, but to the ascent of Christ himself.